Lonely Cowboy took in 13-year-old girl who was left tied to a fence by her drunk father. The sun was setting behind the mesa when Jake Morrison first saw her, a small figure tied to the fence post like some forgotten piece of laundry left to dry in the desert wind. His horse, an old buckskin named Chester, snorted and shied away from the sight, but Jake urged him forward, his weathered hands steady on the reins, despite the shock that coursed through his chest like lightning. The girl couldn't have been more than 13. Her thin frame slumped against the wooden post, wrists bound with frayed rope that had already begun to chafe her skin raw. Her dress, once probably blue, was now the color of dust and desperation, and her dark hair hung in tangled strands across a face that should have been filled with the joy of youth, but instead held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelty too soon. Jake dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling in the evening stillness. He had been riding this stretch of fence line for the better part of 15 years, checking for breaks and strays, and never once had he encountered anything like this. The nearest town was Copper Ridge, a full day's ride south, and the nearest neighbor was old Pete Hawkins, whose spread was at least 10 miles to the east. Out here, in this vast expanse of scrubland and sage, a person could disappear without a trace, and Jake knew that was exactly what someone had been counting on. "Easy there, little one," he said softly, approaching her the same way he would a spooked calf. The girl's eyes flew open at the sound of his voice, and Jake saw fear flash across her features like summer lightning. They were green eyes, he noticed, the color of spring grass after a good rain, and they held a wariness that no child should ever have to carry. She tried to speak but only managed to croak, her lips cracked and bleeding from the sun and wind. Jake pulled his canteen from his saddle and knelt beside her, careful to move slowly so as not to frighten her further. "Here," he said, holding the water to her lips. "Take it slow now." The girl drank greedily at first, then seemed to remember caution and pulled back, studying Jake's face with those two old eyes. He was a man of 53, with gray threading through his brown hair and lines carved deep around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. His face was honest, though, the kind of face that had never learned to lie well, and perhaps she sensed that because she allowed him to give her another sip. "What's your name, child?" Jake asked as he worked at the knots binding her wrists. The rope was tight and cruel, and he could see where it had cut into her skin. Whoever had done this had meant for her to suffer. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening wind. "Sarah Brennan." Jake nodded, filing the name away in his memory. "Well, Sarah Brennan, I'm Jake Morrison, and I'm going to get you out of here." The knots finally gave way, and the girl rubbed her wrists, wincing at the pain. "Can you tell me who did this to you?" The girl's face closed up tight as a shuttered window. "My pa," she said after a long moment. "He was drinking again. Said I was nothing but trouble, and a mouth to feed he couldn't afford. Said the desert could have me." Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. He had known men like that, men who could look at their own flesh and blood and see only burden, only inconvenience. He had been raised by such a man himself, though his father had never gone quite this far. "Where is he now, your pa?" Sarah shrugged, a gesture that tried to be careless but failed. "Gone, I reckon. Probably halfway to Mexico by now, or dead drunk in some saloon. Don't matter much either way." Jake stood and looked around at the endless expanse of desert and sky. The nearest water was his own well, back at the ranch, and that was a good 3 hours' ride. The girl was dehydrated and weak, and night was coming fast. In this country, the temperature could drop 40 degrees once the sun went down, and she was dressed in nothing but that thin cotton dress. "Can you ride?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from the way she struggled to stand on unsteady legs. "I can try," Sarah said, but Jake could see the lie of it in the way she swayed. He lifted her onto Chester with gentle hands, then swung up behind her, wrapping his coat around her small frame. The buckskin snorted at the double load, but settled into his ground-eating walk without complaint. Chester was a good horse, steady and reliable, the kind of mount a man could depend on when the chips were down. As they rode through the gathering darkness, Jake found himself thinking about the choice that lay before him. He could take the girl to town, turn her over to the sheriff, or maybe find some family willing to take her in. That would be the sensible thing. the proper thing. But Jake Morrison had spent most of his life being sensible and proper. And where had it gotten him? He was a man alone in a house too big for one person, working a ranch that had been built for a family he had never managed to have. His wife, Mary, had died in childbirth 12 years ago, along with the son they had planned to name Thomas. Jake had buried them both on the hill behind the house, under the old oak tree that Mary had loved so much, and he had been alone ever since. He had thought about remarrying, had even courted a widow woman in town for a while, but his heart had never been in it. Some wounds he had learned never quite heal right. The girl fell asleep against his chest as they rode, her small body finally giving in to exhaustion. Jake could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress, could see that she had not been eating well for some time. What kind of man, he wondered, could look at his own child and see her as disposable? What kind of father could tie his daughter to a fence post and ride away? The ranch house came into view just after midnight, a low adobe structure that Jake had built with his own hands in the early days of his marriage. It sat in a small valley between two hills, sheltered from the worst of the wind, with a good well and a creek that ran year-round. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it was home, and it was paid for, which was more than most men could say. Jake carried Sarah into the house and laid her on the sofa in the front room, covering her with one of Mary's old quilts. The girl stirred but did not wake, and Jake found himself studying her face in the lamplight. She was pretty, or would be once she got some meat on her bones and lost that haunted look around her eyes. She had good bone structure, high cheekbones, and a strong jaw that spoke of character. Her hands, he noticed, were rough and calloused for such a young girl, the hands of someone who had known work and hardship. Jake made coffee and sat at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the star-filled sky and wrestling with his conscience. He could keep her, he knew. Out here, a man's business was his own, and if Jake Morrison chose to take in a stray, that was between him and God. But what did he know about raising a girl? What did he know about braiding hair and teaching manners and all the things a young woman needed to learn? Then again, what did anyone really know about raising children until they were faced with the task? And this girl, this Sarah, she had already learned some hard lessons about the world. Maybe what she needed was not someone to teach her how to be a lady, but someone to show her that not all men were like her father, that there was such a thing as kindness without strings attached. The girl woke before dawn, sitting up on the sofa with a start, her eyes wide and frightened until she remembered where she was. Jake was already up, had been up for hours, unable to sleep with the weight of decision pressing on his shoulders. "Morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "You hungry?" Sarah nodded, though she still looked ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Jake made pancakes and bacon, more food than he usually bothered with for himself, and watched as the girl ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had not seen a proper meal in days. "This is good," she said shyly, as if complimenting the food might somehow put her in his debt. "My wife's recipe," Jake replied. "She was a fine cook, better than I am." "Where is she?" Sarah asked, then quickly looked down at her plate as if she had overstepped. "Died," Jake said simply. "Long time ago now." They ate in comfortable silence after that, and Jake found himself noticing small things about the girl, the way she held her fork, like someone who had been taught proper table manners once upon a time, the way she sat up straight despite her exhaustion, the way she said please and thank you, without being prompted. Wherever she had come from, whoever had raised her before her father's drinking got the better of him, someone had tried to teach her right from wrong. After breakfast, Jake showed her around the ranch. It was not a large operation, maybe 300 head of cattle and a dozen horses, but it was well maintained and profitable. The house had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a front room, and even a small room that Mary had used for sewing. There was a vegetable garden that had gone to weeds since Mary's death, and a chicken coop that housed a dozen laying hens. "It's beautiful," Sarah said as they stood on the front porch, looking out over the valley. "Peaceful?" Jake nodded. It was peaceful, maybe too peaceful for a man who had spent too many years alone with his thoughts. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think hard before you answer." Do you have any other family? Anybody who might be looking for you? The girl shook her head. Ma died when I was little, and Pa was all I had. No aunts or uncles that I know of. No grandparents still living. What about your pa? You think he might come back? Might change his mind? Sarah's laugh was bitter, too bitter for someone so young. He won't be back. He made that clear enough when he tied me to that fence post. Said I was dead to him and he to me. Jake felt that cold hardness in his stomach again. The anger at a man he had never met but already despised. Well then, he said, making his decision in that moment, I reckon you can stay here if you want to. I could use the help around the place, and you could use a home. What do you say? Sarah stared at him for a long moment, those green eyes searching his face for any sign of deception or hidden motive. You don't know me, she said finally. I might be trouble. I might be more work than I'm worth. Child, Jake said gently, we're all more work than we're worth sometimes. That's what family's for, to love us anyway. The word family hung in the air between them like a promise, and Jake saw something shift in the girl's expression, hope warring with caution. You'd really want me to stay, even though I'm not bloodkin? Blood don't make family, Jake said. Choice does. Caring does. Showing up every day and doing right by each other, that's what makes family. Sarah nodded slowly, and Jake saw tears gather in her eyes, the first real tears she had shed since he found her. I'd like that, she whispered. I'd like that very much. The first weeks were an adjustment for both of them. Sarah threw herself into the work around the ranch with the desperate energy of someone trying to prove her worth. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, tended the vegetable garden, gathered eggs, and even tried her hand at cooking, though her results were mixed at best. Jake watched her with growing concern, recognizing the frantic need to be useful, to be indispensable. That came from years of having her value questioned. You don't have to earn your keep, he told her one evening, as she scrubbed the kitchen floor for the second time that day. You're not here on trial, Sarah. You're here because this is your home now. I want to help, she insisted, not looking up from her scrubbing. I want to be useful. You are useful, Jake said, but you're also a child, and children need time to be children. When's the last time you just sat and watched the sunset, or read a book, or did something just because it made you happy? Sarah paused in her scrubbing, and Jake could see her thinking. I don't remember, she said finally, and the sadness in her voice broke his heart a little. Jake made it his mission after that to show Sarah that life could hold joy as well as work. He taught her to ride, starting her on a gentle mare named Buttercup. He showed her how to fish in the creek that ran behind the house, and how to identify the different birds that nested in the cottonwoods. On Sundays, they would ride into town for supplies and church, and Jake took pride in introducing Sarah as his ward, his responsibility, his family. The townspeople were curious, of course, but Jake Morrison was a respected man in Copper Ridge, known for his honesty and his kindness to neighbors in need. If he said the girl was his ward, then that was good enough for most folks. There were a few questions, a few raised eyebrows, but nothing that couldn't be handled with a steady look and a firm word. It was old Doc Henderson who pulled Jake aside one Sunday after church and asked the question that had been weighing on Jake's mind. You thought about schooling for that girl, Jake? She's bright. Anyone can see that, but she's going to need education if she's going to make her way in the world. Jake had been thinking about that very thing. Sarah could read and write after a fashion, but her education had been spotty at best. She was quick to learn, eager to absorb new knowledge, but there was only so much Jake could teach her himself. Miss Patterson's been asking about her, Doc continued, referring to the town school teacher. Says she'd be happy to work with Sarah, maybe help her catch up on what she's missed. The idea of sending Sarah to town for school filled Jake with an unexpected dread, not because he didn't want her educated, but because he had grown accustomed to her presence around the ranch. She had brought life back to the old place, had filled the silence with her chatter and her questions and her shy laughter. The thought of the house being empty again during the day made his chest tight with something that felt uncomfortably like panic. But it was the right thing to do, he knew that. Sarah deserved every chance to make something of herself, to rise above the circumstances of her birth and her father's failures. So he swallowed his selfish desires and made arrangements with Miss Patterson for Sarah to attend school 3 days a week, riding into town on Buttercup and staying with the school teacher's family when the weather was bad. Sarah was nervous about school at first, worried that the other children would look down on her for being a foundling, for not having a proper family. But her fears proved groundless. The children of Copper Ridge were generally kind, and those who weren't quickly learned to keep their opinions to themselves after Jake Morrison paid a quiet visit to their parents. Sarah flourished in school, soaking up knowledge like desert sand soaks up rain. She had a particular gift for numbers, Miss Patterson reported, and a love of reading that was remarkable in someone who had been denied so many opportunities. She made friends too, real friends who invited her to picnics and church socials and all the normal activities of childhood that she had been denied for so long. But it was at home, on the ranch, that Sarah truly came alive. She had a natural way with animals, a gentleness that the horses and cattle responded to instinctively. She could calm a spooked horse with just her voice, could hand-feed the most stubborn bull without fear. Jake watched her work and marveled at the gift she had been given, the same gift his Mary had possessed. "She's got the touch," old Pete Hawkins observed one day, when he came by to look at a horse Jake was thinking of selling. "Seen it in maybe one person out of 100? Animals just trust her, don't they?" Jake nodded, watching Sarah work with a young colt that had been skittish around everyone else. Under her patient hands, the animal stood calm and still, as if he understood that this human meant no harm. The seasons turned, spring into summer, into fall, and Sarah grew taller and stronger. The hollow look left her eyes, replaced by the bright curiosity of a young person discovering the world's possibilities. She laughed more, talked more, argued with Jake about everything from the best way to plant corn to whether it was going to rain. It was during her second winter at the ranch that the past came calling. Jake was in the barn, tending to a mare who was close to foaling, when he heard the sound of horses approaching. He looked up to see 3 men riding into the yard, and something about them made his hand drift instinctively toward the rifle he kept propped against the barn wall. The leader was a big man with a scraggly beard and clothes that had seen better days. His companions looked cut from the same cloth, hard men with cold eyes who carried themselves like trouble, looking for a place to happen. "You Morrison?" the big man called out, not bothering to dismount. "I am," Jake replied, stepping out of the barn with the rifle now openly in his hands. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "Looking for my daughter," the man said, and Jake felt his blood turn to ice water. "Little girl, about 14 now, dark hair, green eyes. Heard she might be staying here." Jake studied the man's face and saw nothing there but selfishness and cruelty. This was Sarah's father, the man who had tied her to a fence post and left her to die. And now he was here, probably looking to collect some kind of reward or use her for some new scheme. "Don't know what you're talking about," Jake said evenly. The man's eyes narrowed. "Now don't lie to me, Morrison. I got it on good authority that you've been playing daddy to a little girl that ain't yours. That girl belongs to me, and I want her back." "Even if I knew such a girl," Jake said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest, "what would a man like you want with a daughter you abandoned?" The man's face darkened. "That ain't none of your business. She's my blood, my property, and I got rights." "The only right you had," Jake said, raising the rifle slightly, "was to care for that child, protect her, love her. You gave up those rights when you left her tied to a fence post in the middle of nowhere?" Behind him, Jake heard the soft sound of footsteps, and he knew without looking that Sarah had heard the voices and come to investigate. He saw the recognition flash in her father's eyes, saw the ugly smile spread across his face. "There she is," the man said, dismounting now and taking a step forward. "Come on, girl, time to go." Sarah moved up beside Jake, and he could feel her trembling, though her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm not going anywhere with you." "You'll go where I tell you to go," her father snarled. "I'm your pa, and you'll do as I say." "You're no father of mine," Sarah replied, and Jake was proud of the strength in her voice. "A father doesn't abandon his child. A father doesn't tie her up and leave her to die." The man's face twisted with rage. "You little witch! I should have left you there to rot." But I got use for you now. Got a man willing to pay good money for a young wife? Jake felt something snap inside him, a cord of restraint that had been stretched too far. Before he quite knew what he was doing, he had stepped forward and driven the butt of his rifle into the man's stomach, doubling him over with a grunt of pain. "Get off my land," Jake said quietly. The rifle now pointed directly at the man's chest. "Get off my land and don't come back." The man's companions had their hands on their guns, but they were facing a man who had spent 30 years learning to shoot, and they could see death in his eyes. After a tense moment, they helped their leader back onto his horse. "This ain't over, Morrison," the man wheezed. "That girl is mine by law, and I'll be back with the sheriff to prove it." "You do that," Jake said, "but bring a good lawyer with you, because I'll be ready." They rode away in a cloud of dust and curses, and Jake stood watching until they disappeared over the rise. Then he turned to Sarah, who was crying now, the tears streaming down her face like a spring rain. "He can't take me, can he?" she asked. "He can't make me go with him?" Jake set the rifle aside and put his arms around her, holding her close while she cried. "No," he said firmly. "He can't take you. I won't let him." But even as he spoke the words, Jake knew the law was not on their side. A father's rights were strong in this territory, even a father who had proven himself unfit. If the man came back with legal papers, with a sheriff to enforce them, Jake would be powerless to stop him. Unless, of course, he wasn't her father anymore. The idea came to him slowly, then all at once, like dawn breaking over the mountains. There was a way, a legal way, to protect Sarah from her father's claims. It would require a trip to the territorial capital, would require lawyers and paperwork and fees he could ill afford, but it could be done. "Sarah," he said, holding her at arm's length so he could look into her eyes, "how would you feel about becoming a Morrison for real, legal and official, with papers to prove it?" She stared at him in confusion for a moment, then understanding dawned. "You mean adoption? You'd adopt me?" "If you'll have me," Jake said. "If you want to be my daughter, really and truly, then that's what we'll do." Sarah threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that more than anything." The legal proceedings took 3 months. 3 months of worry and waiting, while Jake spent money he couldn't spare on lawyers who spoke in language he didn't understand. But in the end, the papers were signed and sealed, and Sarah Brennan became Sarah Morrison, with all the rights and protections that came with the name. Her biological father did return, as promised, with a sheriff and legal papers of his own. But his documents proved worthless against Jake's adoption decree, and he left empty-handed and cursing, threatening revenge but lacking the means to carry it out. "You're safe now," Jake told Sarah that night as they sat on the front porch, watching the stars come out. "You're my daughter, legal and proper, and no one can change that." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never been before. "I love you, Pa," she said quietly, and Jake felt his heart swell with a joy he had thought he would never feel again. "I love you too, daughter," he replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The years that followed were the happiest of Jake Morrison's life. Sarah grew into a remarkable young woman, strong and intelligent and kind, with her mother's way with animals and her father's stubborn streak when it came to doing what was right. She finished her schooling at the top of her class, then chose to stay on the ranch rather than pursue the teaching position that Miss Patterson had arranged for her in the territorial capital. "This is my home," she said, when Jake suggested she might want to see more of the world. "These are my people, my responsibilities. Besides, someone has to take care of you when you get old and cantankerous." Jake laughed at that, though he was secretly pleased by her decision. The ranch was prospering under their joint management, Sarah's gift with animals complementing his own knowledge of the land and the market. They had expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock, and built a reputation for honest dealing that brought buyers from as far away as Denver. When Sarah turned 20, Jake began to notice the young men of Copper Ridge paying her more attention than he was entirely comfortable with. She was beautiful. There was no denying that, with her mother's grace and a strength that came from years of hard work and honest living. But more than that, she was good, genuinely good in a way that was rare in this hard country. "You thinking of getting married anytime soon?" Jake asked her one evening, trying to sound casual about it. Sarah smiled at his transparent concern. Maybe someday, she said, when I find someone who loves this land as much as I do, who understands that a woman can be strong and still be a lady. Someone who won't try to change me or make me into something I'm not. That's a tall order, Jake observed. Maybe, Sarah agreed, but I'd rather be alone than settle for less than I deserve. You taught me that, you know. You showed me what real love looks like, the kind that doesn't ask you to be smaller or weaker or different than you are. Jake felt tears prick his eyes at her words, pride and love swelling in his chest until he thought it might burst. This girl, this woman, had saved him just as surely as he had saved her all those years ago. She had brought purpose back to his life, had given him a reason to get up each morning and face the day with hope instead of resignation. You saved me, he told her, the words coming from a place so deep he hadn't known it existed. That day I found you tied to that fence post. I thought I was saving you, but you were the one doing the saving. Sarah smiled, that same smile that had lit up his world for 8 years now. We saved each other, she said simply. That's what family does. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. But inside the little adobe house, all was warmth and peace, and the quiet satisfaction of love well given and gratefully received. Jake Morrison had learned, perhaps later than most, but not too late, that family was not about blood or law or obligation. It was about choice, about showing up, about loving someone enough to see them through their darkest moments and celebrate their brightest triumphs. And as he sat there with his daughter, watching the fire burn low in the hearth, Jake knew that he was the richest man in all the territory, not because of the cattle or the land or the money in the bank, but because he had something more precious than gold. He had found his family, and his family had found him. The fence post where he had discovered Sarah still stood on the far edge of his property, weathered now by 8 years of sun and wind and rain. Sometimes when he rode that way, Jake would stop and look at it, remembering that day and marveling at how one moment of choice, one decision to stop and help instead of riding on, had changed everything. Sarah called it her miracle post, the place where her real life had begun. And Jake, who had never been a particularly religious man, found that he couldn't argue with that description. After all, if saving a lost child and gaining a daughter in return wasn't a miracle, then he didn't know what was. The desert could be a harsh and unforgiving place, but it could also be a place of second chances, of new beginnings, of love found in the most unlikely circumstances. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, it could even be a place where broken things were made whole again, where lost souls found their way home, and where two people who needed each other could build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. That, Jake Morrison knew, was miracle enough for any man,